On April 25, 2007, a solemn and somber atmosphere filled Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior. Under the watchful eyes of then-Russian President Vladimir Putin, former U.S. Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and a host of other international dignitaries, the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation was slowly draped over the coffin of Boris Yeltsin. This was the first state funeral for a former head of state in modern Russian history. However, for the Russian people still reeling from the chaos of the previous decade, the scene was deeply ironic. The very man Putin was burying with the highest state honors was a former president who, upon his resignation 7 years earlier, had an approval rating in the single digits. To ordinary Russians, he was widely seen as the great thief who had plundered the nation, allowing it to collapse into the hands of oligarchs. So why would Putin, the iron-fisted leader who built his entire political foundation on restoring order and fixing the mistakes of the 1990s, go to such lengths to protect the very man whose era he had repudiated? Why, after already passing laws to guarantee Yeltsin's personal safety and fortune, would Putin stage a state funeral to elevate this controversial former president to an even higher place in history? The logic behind it is far more complex than simply keeping a promise. As a core figure in modern Russia, Putin's story will take dozens of episodes to tell. If your eyes get tired from watching long videos, why not try a different way? Turn off the screen and let your ears do the storytelling. Click the audio app in the bottom left corner of the video to switch to audio-only mode. The story will continue even when your screen is locked, and you can set a sleep timer for extra convenience. Binge Putin's entire presidential career in one go. Outside of Russia, public opinion of Yeltsin has always been extremely high. He is often hailed as the father of modern Russia and the sole beacon of light during the final days of the Soviet Union. But in the hearts of Russians, Yeltsin is seen as a thief who plundered the nation from every conceivable angle. Yeltsin's first great crime was the complete destruction of Russia's economy. Starting in 1992, in a rush to transition to a market economy, the Yeltsin government, led by Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, completely deregulated prices. The immediate consequence was disastrous hyperinflation. In 1992 alone, consumer prices soared by 2,500%. This public looting of the people's savings turned the life savings of countless families into worthless paper overnight. By 1999, Russia's GDP had shrunk by nearly 40% compared to 1991, and its industrial output had fallen to levels not seen since the 1960s. Yeltsin's second crime was creating a crisis of survival for the Russian people. Due to the deteriorating economy and his government's inept response, basic human welfare indicators saw a shocking decline in the 1990s. Throughout the decade, over a third of Russia's population below the poverty line. The collapse of this social welfare system led to a severe degradation of public services like healthcare and education. The life expectancy for Russian men plummeted from around 64 years in the late 1980s to just 57.6 years in 1994. A statistical freefall virtually unheard of in a modern nation at peace. Yeltsin's third crime was the outright theft of political power. Before the 1996 election, Yeltsin's approval rating had plummeted to the single digits. To raise funds for his presidential campaign, he handed over the nation's most critical assets, such as the Yukos Oil Company and Norilsk Nickel, to Russia's 7 most powerful oligarchs under the guise of a loans for shares program. This blatant exchange of assets for political support not only managed to turn the election around, but after winning, Yeltsin claimed he couldn't repay the loans, allowing the oligarchs to legally seize control of these strategic enterprises at rock-bottom prices. By 1999, with his approval ratings once again at rock bottom, Yeltsin knew he was out of options. His only hope was to find a successor who was absolutely dependable, someone who could protect his legacy and, more importantly, his freedom. Putin's rise to power was the direct result of this desperate wish becoming a reality. As mentioned in previous episodes, the reason Yeltsin chose Putin from a field of many candidates wasn't because of his impressive political background. The sole reason was that Putin was sufficiently clean and, crucially, reliable. Putin was neither an old-guard bureaucrat nor a puppet of the oligarchs. Most importantly, he had proven his most valuable quality: loyalty. When his mentor, Anatoly Sobchak, lost his election, Putin unhesitatingly resigned from his post. When Sobchak faced prison time, Putin, at the risk of destroying his own political future, personally arranged to get him safely out of the country. These examples convinced Yeltsin that making Putin president was his only chance to avoid total ruin and prosecution. So in August 1999, he not only personally appointed Putin as prime minister, but also refused to simply fade into the background. In the final months of his active political life, Yeltsin used nearly all of his remaining political capital to pave Putin's path to the pinnacle of power. First, Yeltsin gave Putin unprecedented public political backing. On the very day he appointed Putin, Yeltsin gave a famous televised address in which he not only nominated Putin for the next presidency, but declared to all of Russia his belief that Putin would win the 2000 election. In the Kremlin, this was a public endorsement and a political coronation. Yeltsin was effectively demanding that Russia's entire political elite pick a side immediately. Simultaneously, after the outbreak of the Second Chechen War, Yeltsin granted Putin complete military command, eliminating the political interference that had plagued the First War and providing the strongest possible political backing for Putin's iron-fisted tactics. Even with military success in Chechnya, Yeltsin didn't let his guard down. As the 2000 election approached, he personally oversaw the creation of a custom-built campaign machine for Putin. In the fall of 1999, a political movement called Unity was hastily assembled for the sole purpose of rallying support for Putin in the upcoming State Duma elections. Under Yeltsin's influence, this brand-new pro-Putin coalition, led by Sergei Shoigu, won over 23% of the vote in the December 1999 parliamentary elections, becoming the second-largest party after the Communists. After achieving this, Yeltsin made his final, unexpected move. On New Year's Eve 1999, he suddenly announced his resignation during his televised address. At that moment, Putin's popularity was sky-high, thanks to the victory in Chechnya, with his approval rating exceeding 70%. Yeltsin's early resignation allowed Putin, as acting president, to run with the immense advantage of an incumbent in the presidential election, which was now moved up to March 2000. It's fair to say that every step of Putin's political career, starting in 1999, was orchestrated by Yeltsin. Without Yeltsin, Putin might well have become just another middle-aged, unemployed official in St. Petersburg. But with Yeltsin's help, this same man was catapulted to the highest office in the Russian Federation in just 4 years. Even if there is no written proof of a deal between them, it is undeniable that Yeltsin personally carried Putin to the presidential throne. Thus, after officially becoming president in May 2000, how to handle the universally despised Yeltsin became Putin's most delicate problem. In reality, Yeltsin's judgment had been spot on. Putin was not only intensely loyal, but also a man who pays his debts. In fact, on December 31st, 1999, the very day Yeltsin resigned and made him acting president, the first document Putin signed was a presidential decree granting immunity to the former president and his family. This decree single-handedly saved Yeltsin from the threat of prison. Later, on February 12, 2001, President Putin signed a federal law of the same name, cementing this protection for the long term. However, Putin was no fool. He knew his core mission was to protect the Yeltsin family, not their baggage. To avoid any negative impact on his own political career, he swiftly firewalled himself from the Yeltsin entire team once he secured power. Not only did Yeltsin himself retire to a quiet life, but his influential son-in-law, Valentin Yumashev, and daughter, Tatiana Dyachkin, were politely ushered out of the Kremlin. As for the oligarchs closely tied to Yeltsin, they were certainly not covered by Putin's protection. A powerful figure like Boris Berezovsky was driven out of Russia through a series of prosecutions and ultimately died in exile. Putin's actions both fulfilled his promise to Yeltsin and, by eliminating Yeltsin's negative political influence, gave the long-suffering Russian people a sense of justice. Therefore, after 2002, although public criticism of Yeltsin in Russia only grew, most people credited him with the wisdom of choosing Putin as his successor. As a result, few within Russia had any desire to bother the old man who was already close to death. By all accounts, simply ensuring Yeltsin wasn't prosecuted was enough for Putin to have fulfilled his promise. Letting Yeltsin die a quiet death would have sufficed. So why did Putin go a step further and grant him a state funeral? The truth is, the state funeral wasn't about honoring the man. It was a forward-looking political statement. By 2007, Putin's political position was incredibly secure. His legitimacy was largely built on the repudiation of the Yeltsin era. Had Putin simply let Yeltsin die quietly, it might have been interpreted as him being petty or still living in Yeltsin's shadow. But by holding a state funeral of the highest order, Putin was symbolically declaring that the Yeltsin era was definitively over. Furthermore, it reinforced the narrative that Putin was the one who had corrected those mistakes. The funeral was also a signal to Russia's entire elite. Putin was showing them through his actions, as long as you play by the rules, even if you make mistakes or fall from power in the future, I will grant you a final measure of dignity and protection. Yeltsin's state funeral was in essence a final farewell for Putin and the entire Russian nation to the chaotic 1990s. The age of Putin, the era that began with the famous promise, "Give me 20 years and I will give you back a strong Russia," was now truly underway.